We've had a request to go through a Part A question on Bultmann from the Kerygma unit. That's theme 1E for Christianity. And the question we're going to look at together is explain Bultmann's challenges to the Kerygma. So, as always, I sit and type these out. I give myself 20 minutes of typing time to write these, and I do these without notes, without my Bible, so they are not perfect. However, they should be enough to get an AA star. They also tend to be a little bit long because obviously you can type much more in 20 minutes than you can write. So usually you want to knock off about 100 words. So that is worth bearing in mind. But I think it's useful for you guys to have quite a rich answer that you can take a lot away from. As always, as I talk through the answer, I'm going to show you how I'm demonstrating the skills that the examiner is looking for. So they're looking for me to use technical language. That is either the language of the scholar or words that basically you use in RE lessons that you don't use in your other lessons. They're looking for evidence / sources of wisdom. So this could be a quote from Bultmann, but I'm not great at remembering quotes, so that's quite rare. It's more likely for me to be a Bible quote. It could be scholars' schools of thought. Now, it's not going to be a very good answer to this question if Bultmann isn't included, and so he is going to be in each paragraph, but you are going to see very brief references to C H Dodd, who is the other scholar for Kerygma, and Crossan and Schweitzer, Heidegger, who's an influence on Bultmann. And for schools of thought, there's going to be references to existentialism, form criticism, and Gnosticism. So I'm providing you with a very rich answer. And I'm going to be honest, as I was writing this, I was finding it quite difficult to make sure that I was remaining on track and answering this question here rather than telling you everything that I knew about Bultmann, because I find Bultmann fascinating. And so I have used linking statements, often at the start, sometimes at the end, and sometimes at both ends of a paragraph. I do have a slight introductory statement, and I did that because I could feel myself struggling to answer the question a little bit, and so my introduction is kind of setting me out on where I'm going to go, and is also directly mirroring the question. So the question is, explain Bultmann's challenges to the Kerygma, and I begin with the word Bultmann. So Bultmann agrees with C H Dodd that the Kerygma, so I'm linking back already, has great value, but there are significant challenges. And then I said that those challenges are about historicity and for Christians to find meaning. And then again, I talk about Bultmann's challenges to the Kerygma come from his desire to have an existential understanding. So existential would count not just as a key term, but a school of thought, understanding of the Bible. This means interpreting the text in a way that is meaningful to individuals today in light of their own experiences and worldview. And that's why I'm going to stick to with my answer. So let's look at my first paragraph, and this is where I am sort of unpacking and explaining demythologization, although I think that as I look at this, have I used the word? I must have done, but linking it with Kerygma in particular. So Bultmann states that the Bible reflects a pre-scientific worldview. That would count as a key term. Okay, so in the first century, they viewed the world as having 3 tiers, heaven, hell and earth, and supernatural forces would intervene, and that's what miracles are, and they were waiting for some kind of apocalyptic event to end the world as they know it. My source of wisdom, because it's Kerygma, is going to be Acts 2, and I'm arguing that Acts 2 reveals that worldview. So it talks about Jesus ascending into heaven. I then do a little bit of unpacking, so that suggests that heaven is a place and it's up there. There's an apocalyptic vision of the day of the Lord, that's a quote from Acts 2, where the sun turns dark and the moon turns blood red. Also, Jesus performs miracles, and those continue even after he has ascended into heaven. and they are actually called wonders in Acts, so that's why I have used that word there. And so Bultmann says that when we are faced with that kind of language, as modern readers, we have three choices. We can reject the story completely. We can accept the story with the myth, or we can remove the mythological content, which is the route that Bultmann takes. And actually, I have not used the word demythologize. That is a mistake of mine. You should do that. So the challenge for the modern reader was to strip away the myth. I'm going to correct that. Or demythologize the text without losing the core message. Okay. And then demythologize counts then as a key term. So then I'm going to... And can you notice that again, before I move on, I've linked back to the question. So the challenge for the modern reader, which links back to explain Bultmann's challenges. Then I'm going on to paragraph 2, and as well as there being a pre-scientific worldview that permeates the speeches in Acts or the Kerygma, there is also a particular worldview which is that of Gnosticism. And we have met Gnosticism before when we looked at the birth stories and incarnation, and also a little bit in theme too. So Bultmann would count as a form critic, and so he is analysing those stories, and he's looking for sort of editing choices that the authors make and the influence of the setting or the Sitzimleben of the authors. Remember, he's German, Bultmann. And so one of the Sitzimleben, the setting in life of the writing of the speeches in Acts, is against a background where Gnosticism is influential. And there are disagreements about whether Gnosticism influences Christianity in a positive way, as in they take ideas from Gnosticism, or whether it's in a negative way, as in they're constantly trying to fight against Gnostic ideas. But whichever way you go, there's a Gnostic influence. And again, Bultmann says this is something that needs removing from the text. So some things that the Gnostics believe. So they were dualists. They also believed, and dualist would count as a key term, they believed that the world was caught in some kind of great cosmic battle between good and evil, and that our spiritual selves, our souls, needed to be liberated from our physical bodies. And so I looked then through Acts 2 where I could possibly see evidence to back up that claim. So at the start of Acts 2, or the start of St. Peter's speech, there's that prophecy from Joel that talks about pouring out Spirit on the flesh in the last days. That to me sounds like that dualistic battle at the end of times. But also in each of the speeches there's an instruction for the listeners to repent and be baptized. So perhaps there's an inference there that you're going to have secret knowledge that's going to save you. And so then once again I link back to the statement, the challenge to the Kerygma is to strip away not just a first century pre-scientific view, but also the influence of the Gnostics. So next paragraph, and here I'm going to introduce a few more scholars. So I've got Ramirez, who we met when we looked at Jesus and the birth stories, and Crossan, who of course is in theme 1F. And so when Bultmann was writing at the start of the 20th century, for at least 100 years, in fact longer, because Ramirez is from much earlier, there had been a tradition of trying to find out what the historical Jesus was like. And that started with Ramirez and, to some extent continues with scholars like Crossan today. And Bultmann just says this is futile, and you just can't get back to the historical Jesus. You can't strip back those layers. And along with Schweitzer, he says that when you look at scholars who try and do this, what they're actually doing is they're finding out their interpretation of Jesus. So Schweitzer says that when people try and find the historical Jesus, we learn more about them than we do Jesus. And therefore, Bultmann challenges C H Dodd's claim that the speeches and acts contain historical statements about either who Jesus was or the actions of the first Christians. And Bultmann just says that's not true. I've deliberately used the word challenge there so that I'm starting to link back to the question. So Bultmann challenges the claim that the speeches and acts contain historical information. And he says what they do is they tell us about the Jesus of faith, that's a Bultmann term, and not the historical figure. But that doesn't mean they don't have value. For Bultmann, to learn about the Jesus of faith is much, much more valuable. And then we're going to the final paragraph. And so, again, I'm going to talk about the background to Bultmann to help illuminate really why Bultmann challenges the Kerygma. And so something else that is happening at the start of the 20th century is that, in particular, German liberal scholars like Bultmann, because they saw this mythological language, they stripped it all back and they end up with Jesus just being a moral teacher. I could have put Harnack in there as a scholar who was doing that. But for Bultmann, that is a step too far. So Bultmann isn't trying to undermine the Bible, and people who don't get Bultmann, they think that's what he's trying to do. I think that's why he's attacked so much. But instead, he's saying that what we need to do is to strip away all the myth and get to the message of the Kerygma that God has offered, or through Jesus we have salvation. And the challenge, so I've deliberately used that word again to link back with the question, the challenge is for humans to understand that message, but also to make it work with our worldview. So that I'm going back to existentialism, because that's an important philosophy for Bultmann. He's sometimes referred to as a Christian existentialist. And one philosopher who's very influential on Bultmann is Heidegger. So I'm showing a wide range of knowledge that's going to impress the examiner. And so, influenced by Heidegger, Bultmann says that the message of the Kerygma is that we have been saved from our fallen state. And that means that we can live a life authentic to ourselves. That is great freedom, to not have to be something else or act in a certain way. And for Bultmann, you're not going to get that message from the gospel stories of Jesus, which are totally wrapped up in mythological stories. And my evidence for that is, the birth stories. I could have said the virgin birth, the miracles and the resurrection. Where you're going to access the truth about the power of Jesus is in the experiences of the apostles in the book of Acts. And when they are describing the impact that Jesus has had on them, that is the valuable bit. So the apostles have gone from seeing Jesus crucified and feeling alone and scared to suddenly feeling awake and full of hope for the future. And the challenge for Christians is to take away that feeling and find it in themselves when they approach Jesus. And Bultmann says if there's one part of Acts that is valuable, it's Acts 2:37, and that's where the apostles say that they feel cut to the heart and they're like, what shall we do? What shall we do? And I'm going to end by linking back to the original question. And so the challenge for Christians today when it comes to the Kerygma is to recognise that, like the disciples, Jesus has a power that cuts them to the core, cuts them to the heart, and there's a challenge to us where we say, what are we going to do in response?